Would you put your hands together for Chef Sean the Sioux Chef?
All right. All right, well, thank you guys. We're just gonna jump right into it. I know our timing is a little funny, so I just want to, I'm gonna show a little video really quick, but my name's Sean Sherman. I grew up in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota. I did high school and college in Spearfish. I went to Black Hills State. I moved to Minneapolis shortly after college, around 97, and I've been in Minneapolis for most of the time. I did move out of Minneapolis for a little while, but I've been pretty much based and centered there, and my career has been there. I'm going to show this little video that kind of shows you and talks about some of the work that we do, and I'm going to go through my presentation that really talks about why we're so passionate about the work and how we think people could really start to look at food and land and community different, utilizing the past and the history, especially the land that we're currently occupying today.
The land, the animals, the plants. Within Lakota philosophy, we're kind of all a part of everything. I think you can feel it when you're out in these regions and when we're out gathering some of these foods and flavors that people have been utilizing for millennia. Indigenous foods is just the knowledge of our landscape. Nobody had any sense of what Native American food was, and it was something that I had to figure out. My name is Sean Sherman. I am the CEO and founder of the Sioux Chef. Dana Thompson and I have been running the company since the beginning. Our mission is not only revitalizing Native American cuisine, but it's also re-identifying what North American cuisine is to people. I was barely 13 when I started working restaurants. Kind of ridiculous to think about how I could walk around the city and find food from all over the world and nothing to represent the indigenous cultures that were right there and had been making food there for millennia. I had kind of this epiphany moment where I just realized like I should be focused on the background of my own heritage. I'm an enrolled member of the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe. Where Pine Ridge and the Badlands are all kind of merged together, the land is not ideal for growing things. It is a tough landscape, and that is the land that was given to the Lakota to be their home place. There were no restaurants on the whole reservation. It's a large area. Those disparities you see, and just health problems in general. And we lost a lot of our food knowledge and a lot of our traditional ways around food. One of the best parts about the indigenous foods is the health aspect. It's this awesome, low glycemic, lots of plant diversity, low salt. It's almost a perfect diet, and we can, really work on a lot of these health problems just through our traditional foods. Part of the reason for having this dinner party is to announce our nonprofit, the North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. Part of our business model is to utilize indigenous food producers first. For example, Thunder Valley. How's it going?
Hey, Sean.
How are you?
Good. How about yourself?
Good. Well, I'm excited to see what you guys have going on. I haven't been out here for a couple of years.
Our garden here is actually our classroom, and we host workshops and trainings on every aspect of this garden.
We try to incorporate as much as we can from foraging whatever's in season at that moment to be a part of our dinner. Really fortunate that I could call up my Uncle Richard, who happens to be an ethnobotanist and expert on the plants in the Badlands, and was able to take us out to Sheep Mountain Table to do some foraging. What we're looking for is just anything we can add to the dinner tonight. So any of the wild flavors that are out here, I'd imagine we can pick up some sage and probably some juniper. But what do you think's out and about right now at this time of year?
Well, it's kind of late in the season now, but we might look for some choke cherries if there's some left. And but we have one called Bush Morning Glory. is a plant that grows back here. Seems to be a profusion in this area.
We just enjoy cooking foods that really taste like a place. We just submitted our paperwork for our nonprofit called Natives.org. Natives.org is focused on food education and indigenous food access. So the restaurant we've been working on is actually going to be housed under the nonprofit.
It's been a wild, fast, furious 4 years.
We're trying to make food with only indigenous ingredients, so we've cut out anything that wasn't here before. So we're not using any dairy, any wheat flour, any processed sugar. We're not even using beef, pork, or chicken. And we spent the last couple of days out in the Black Hills and Badlands, gathering some seasonings and herbs and flowers and things to use on the plates.
It was a huge inspiration to us as we're launching this nonprofit.
We're kind of at the spot after many, many years of being kept down to having this potential to do something new by utilizing the knowledge of the past and the tools that we have today to evolve this food into something new and beautiful for the future. Understanding other people's food is a great way to really understanding who they are. Food is the one thing that we all have in common, and food is something that we can all share together. It's important to have that sense of community. We should be the answer to our ancestors' prayers. It's about this next generation of youth coming out and the knowledge that they'll carry.
All right. All right, so I'm sure a lot of you guys recognize a lot of that scenery that's in that video. We shot that all around Pine Ridge and the Black Hills. So the work that we do is really trying to bring awareness to indigenous foods, because as a chef, I had an epiphany moment when I was younger, not even that long ago, really, like a little over a decade ago. I just had all of a sudden realized that I was in a city in Minneapolis, and there was all these great restaurants around, and I could find that food from all over the world to go to all these restaurants, but there was nothing that represented the land or the history that we were on. And I also realized, as an Oglala Lakota, growing up on Pine Ridge, that I really didn't know that much about the traditional foods of the Lakota. I could name probably less than 10 recipes of Lakota foods that seemed like they were truly Lakota and didn't have cream of mushroom soup in it, right? So I needed, I really wanted to go back and really understand what was authentic, what was true, like what was the root of it. And I could name hundreds of European recipes, because that's how you learn culinary. You learn about all this European technique. And it was, which is great, but I wanted to really see what were my ancestors eating. So it was really about trying to identify, Native American foods in general in the very beginning. And I focused in the early days just upon my heritage of being Lakota and what people were eating in these regions. And I started expanding, when I moved back to Minnesota, I started really learning more about the Ojibwe tribes, the Anishinaabe tribes up there, and learning more about the farming tribes like the Hidatsas and the Arikras and the Mandans and the Potawatomi and the Poncas and all these other tribes around us. And it really started. So today we're looking at North America as a whole. We look at all this indigenous culture from Mexico all the way up through Alaska. And there's so much to learn out there. And we feel like it's really important for anybody to learn the knowledge of how people survived on these lands, utilizing just plants and animals, basically, and the knowledge of it and the traditions around those. There's a lot of beautiful lessons that we can learn of how these communities survive sustainably utilizing those pieces. So this work really is about understanding a deeper sense of North America in general, because North America's history does begin with indigenous history, and we should know more about it. We should have better history lessons when we're growing up, and there's a lot we could do a lot better with our education around indigenous peoples. It can be a sore subject, but so we use terms like, what are pre-colonial foods? First off, you have to understand what is colonialism, because that's a big part of the equation as to why there aren't Native American restaurants all over the country, even though there should be, because no matter where you are in North America, you're standing on indigenous land, and we should be celebrating that diversity and that history. So to understand colonialism, the easiest way is just to Google it. So if you Google colonialism, you get the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. And we see this all through history. We see it especially coming out of Europe, but you see it affecting areas around on a global scale. Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, South America, Central America, North America. It's all about this European power coming through and taking over all these indigenous lands and utilizing them, taking those resources and making themselves really rich. So, but what people don't realize is how recent in American history this actually happens, because they don't think about it because our history books don't really talk about it. So when our country is brand new in 1783, the U.S. government holds a very little land claim, really, on this continent of North America. Even though the European powers are cutting it all up, France has a section, Great Britain's holding on to big chunks, Spain's got big pieces, Russia's trying to get into it, and it's been like that. But this happens really quickly when the U.S. government really sets its sight to push to take over all this landmass. And, and it's really damaging for, of course, the indigenous peoples who had been living there for millennia. And it happens really quickly, especially in the 1800s, where at 1800, still like 80% of that landmass is under indigenous control, despite the European powers laying claim to those places. So during this time period, there's an immense amount of trauma happening to indigenous communities. There's open genocide happening. There's people are getting relocated. People are being forced marched to different regions. All of this stuff is happening. And some areas, like our area where we're standing in right now, people fought hard to hold on to these regions and to their way of lifestyle. So growing up in Pine Ridge, we were one of the last few, groups that really held out really long. So, people were still fighting the U.S. government up until the late 1800s. And it is what it is today, but we have less than 1% of the landmass, as far as indigenous peoples go. And we just, our stories aren't really talked about that much. And that's part of the work that we're doing, is just trying to bring awareness to that side of it. Because it's theft of indigenous lands that happened on a massive scale through things like the Homestead Act in 1862 or the Dawes Act of 1887, and just all of this openness about removing indigenous peoples, and just how blatant and strategic it was against the indigenous peoples to lay claim to this. So we really want to, get people to think about the land again. This is a picture in Minnesota, where I'm currently at in Minneapolis. After the Dakota War, the Dakota people were placed into this concentration camp and made to stay there. Then they're eventually dispersed into the Dakotas. So like my grandmother's line, who comes from Oak Creek, came from the Dakota line, who had been kicked out of Minnesota and pushed out this way. And, they passed in 1863, Congress passed the Dakota Expulsion Act in Minnesota, making it illegal to be Dakota in their homeland in Minneapolis, or in the Minnesota region. And that law was actually never overturned. So today, actually on the books, it's still illegal to be a Dakota person within the lines of Minnesota. So there's just a lot of history that we could be repairing, going forward, because this is ancestral trauma that's very much alive today for a lot of indigenous families. And we saw, as indigenous peoples, the mass changing of this landscape, the huge deforestation that happens across this whole stretch. Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Pacific Northwest, huge changes in the ecosystems happening in a very short time period. And we also see our foodways as indigenous peoples disappearing really fast too. So we see, we know that food is power, and if you can control food, you control the people, is what Kissinger says. But really, it's true. If you can control your own food, you can control your own destiny as a part of it. Because indigenous peoples never had to pay for food; they just worked really hard for food. They harvested food, they grew food, they collected food, they traded for food. Everybody had something. We're working towards their food in some way or another, but as a group, as a community, to supply enough food for their community, right? So we see the U.S. government early on really being, strategic about taking out the food supplies, because it really is an act of war to make. If you can take out somebody's food, you can make them more susceptible to, to take over, right? So we see lots of destruction of crops and seeds. We see the mass destruction of bison, which almost disappears completely before the end of the 1800s. Like less than 1% of those animals existed. There was like 500 or something like that left alive around that turn of the century. And we see basically the biggest piece to us as indigenous peoples was the loss of our knowledge and the loss of our education. So if you identify what is indigenous education, it's thousands of generations of knowledge being handed down generation after generation through those families, through those communities, of how to do that, how to live sustainably utilizing plants and animals of your region, and all the technique and tradition that goes along with it. And we see this disappearing at an extreme rate after the reservation systems are formed and after the loss of all this indigenous land. So we see this next generation of indigenous children at the turn of the century who are being pulled away from their families, and they're being forced to go to boarding school systems where they're being forced to learn new religions, learn a different language, just complete assimilation of their culture, and it's forced assimilation. And we see this on a mass scale. So Carlisle Indian School is the first one that starts in Pennsylvania. And tons of kids from all these different nations with all these different languages, all these different religions are going there and being forced to become something that they're not. And this is really damaging for Indigenous peoples, because we're losing so much of our knowledge base that's so precious. And it was really damaging. This is a boarding school in Pine Ridge where my grandparents went, and I think this photo is so powerful because the families were setting up camp just to see their kids because they weren't even allowed to talk to them, because they didn't want to ruin those assimilation efforts that were happening in those school systems. And a lot of us as Indigenous peoples have this very much in our family. Like, our mothers went to boarding school, our grandmothers went to boarding school. And we see these boarding schools all over the U.S., we see them all over Canada. Canada had them, they called them residential schools, and they were alive up until the 1990s. So this was extremely damaging. And this forced assimilation, learning the different religions that had nothing to do with us, learning trades that had nothing to do with us, like carpentry, house cleaning, things like that, weren't really helping us at all when we had this better knowledge base to choose from. And people were forced to do this. Like, these were tiny handcuffs that are at Carlisle that were used on these tiny kids down there. These are just children. They're from the ages of like 4, upwards. And it was super harsh. So for me, growing up in post-colonial America, which is where we are, right? People would ask me, like, what kind of foods did you eat growing up on the reservation? Because they want to hear a cool story, like, oh, I'd get up in the morning, hunt down an elk with a slingshot, have a big feast, collect a bunch of stuff along the way. But, I grew up in post-colonial in America, where I grew up primarily on the commodity food program. I grew up with very little nutrition growing up because this is all we had. We were forced, and it didn't even look that pretty when I was growing up because we basically had things that just said beef with juices on the cans growing up, right? And there's very little. The problem with the commodity food program, so commodity food program started in the 1930s as a farm supplement program by the U.S. government to help out all these immigrant farmers that got spread all over the Midwest and to create a surplus of foods for schools, for hospitals, for military, and for a lot of these treaties that they had signed with the Native American groups, communities all across the country. But the problem with the commodity food program is it's never been a nutritional program. So it's actually only made a lot of Indigenous people sick. And we can see that in real time today by looking at the statistics of Indigenous communities and the high rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, you name it. All these foodborne illnesses are a direct result of having to survive off of a very non-nutritional program. And things like Indian tacos, which a lot of us might know as Indigenous foods and celebrate, but it actually doesn't have anything really to do with us because, again, if you decolonize that plate, there was no wheat flour here before. That was something that was given us through military, and we did learn to live with it and grow with it. It became a sense of pride for us, but it shouldn't represent every Indigenous group all across North America because we're so diverse and we have so many cool knowledges that we could be sharing, and our regions are so cool. So there's so much more we can be doing with Indigenous foods, and we still live in an area where there's just open, stereotypes out there against Indigenous peoples. Our voices fall very silent when it comes down to it, and we can just be doing so much better with representing the Indigenous land that we're on and the peoples that are still alive here today. And food is a great way to do it. So to understand a food system, you have to think about how diverse North America is, with the ecoregions, with everything. So North America is extremely diverse, and when you look at Indigenous peoples in North America, you have to think about what's still here. We have 634 tribes in Canada, 573 in the U.S., up to 20% of Mexico still speaks Indigenous languages over Spanish. There's a lot of Indigenous culture alive down there. And so if you look at an Indigenous language map of North America, you see how diverse it is. It's extremely diverse. Every few hundred miles you're driving, it's a different language, a different religion. It's just completely different. There's so much diversity, and we should be celebrating that. And it doesn't matter who speaks Spanish or English or French. Those are all colonial languages. It's really about the underlying, whose land are you actually standing on, and how did people survive there for so long? These are educations that we should be focused on. So when we're looking at Indigenous education, we're taking into account all of these pieces to understand the food as a whole. So it's not just about how to cook something. There's so much more that goes into it, because this is how communities survived together for so long, how they were able to, having all of this information available to them at all times to be able to live together, basically, right? So for us, plants were the key to really unlocking this knowledge. So understanding wild foods was a big part of it because I knew my ancestors had generations of knowledge behind them of how to identify plants and how to utilize it. Everything out there has a purpose, right? Everything except for ticks, but everything else out there has a purpose. So this is just walking around the plains. This is up by Sisseton, and people would just look like, oh, it's just so boring out here. There's nothing out here. But actually, if you take the time to look, you'll see so much food and flavor and health out there all around you. And it's like that everywhere you are. You just have to take the time to learn the plants, So stop using the term weed because that just means you don't know what it is probably, right? Take the time to learn the plants. And, I tease people because, like, our kids can name more Kardashians than they can tree species, We should be teaching them things that matter, things that are real time in their world right in front of us. And those are the things that we really need to think about. We start seeing food and flavor everywhere. Sumacs, choke cherries, spring vegetables like spruce tips and wild onions, those are the ramps. Thinking about how indigenous peoples utilize time differently because they went off of moon systems, and every moon was very telling, and each tribe had different names for the different moons depending on their region. It would talk about the foods that were in their areas, right? Mushrooms, it's a great study, obviously not plants, but staples like Timpsila, which grow all over and are up right now, like people should be harvesting that. And that used to grow all the way down into Texas, all the way up into Canada, or the camas roots in the Pacific Northwest were a super important staple. The wild rice in Minnesota, you guys will be having some true Minnesota wild rice, which is not like the black stuff you see in the rice-a-roni packs at all, because this stuff is hand harvested, doesn't take any petroleum product to do it, and it's really beautiful. And it's just, they come in all sorts of hues and colors and aromas, and it's just so much better. And it's just something that's been around for such a long time. But we're losing a lot of it because we've wasted away a lot of waterways, we've polluted a lot of waterways, and that's why I see a lot of groups fighting to protect those waterways, because we have very little of that left as it is, and we want to protect what is there, because that stuff's been making families happy for a long time. And also just the study of plants in the water in general, because it's not just the plants on the land, people that live by the oceans, or understanding all of these plants have a purpose somehow, and figuring out what to do with them. Or if you're in the desert where all the plants look like they want to hurt you or maim you, indigenous peoples knew how to use them. It's silly to use a term like food desert because the indigenous peoples that lived in the desert knew it was ripe with food everywhere, and they were able to survive there for for thousands and thousands of years. So it's just understanding food in general about land. Protein I feel like is the easiest piece because anybody can hunt down an animal and break it apart, and there's all sorts of parts. And indigenous peoples were really efficient, so they made sure to use everything and not waste anything. So it's really important to think about that. Like, you don't need to just eat the prime pieces every night. You don't need to just have tenderloin or ribeye, because there's all sorts of pieces. Like, protein is protein, right? Shouldn't be afraid of other parts of an animal, and because we should be eating a little bit more sustainable and not wasting all these other pieces. So pretty much any animal out there is literally game when it comes to food, whether it's seafood, fish, shellfish, even insects. And we teach about that because it's so normal to use insects as proteins all over the world, and it was normal here way up into these regions too. We were showing kids in California how to harvest these. So we're going to boil them up first. And then we're going to sorry. We showed these kids in California just this spring how to harvest these caterpillars. They were having this huge super bloom, and these caterpillars were out everywhere, and they were a traditional food for that region. And at first the kids are a little weirded out, like, I'm not eating a bug, but by the end of it, everybody is like, I want to try it, because it's just protein when it comes down to it, like any other. Like, shrimp are weird, you have to look at them, right? Like, anything is weird, but it's just how much you get used to it, and things can taste good. But a bigger important part for us was North American agriculture, because we live in this world where we see this, but indigenous agriculture is ancient. It's been going on a long time, and it's really unsung, especially in North America, because there's a lot of amazing diversity out there of agriculture. We see what the Spanish first saw in Mexico City area when they first got there. and how they had these raised bed gardens in the water that was able to sustain this huge city area, right? It's really amazing the different styles of farming that people came up with, or farming in the middle of the desert. This is a Zuni farm in New Mexico, figuring out how to do a waffle system to keep moisture centered and focused so they can grow corns, beans, squash, sunflowers, chilies, things like that in the middle of the desert for thousands of years, which it's a huge feat, right? And that's a lot of tradition. You know, Three Sisters mound systems, but that comes more for the East Coast with the corns and the beans and squash. And you see that same crop, but there's a lot of diversity in that crop. Or way up here, this is right inside North Dakota along the Missouri River. It's a Hidatsa woman named Buffalo Bird Woman growing the same kind of crops with corns and beans and squash. And we're lucky that we have any of that seed diversity left or any of these stories, because there's a lot of cool ancient seeds still alive today. And part of the work I did in the very beginning was align myself with some of these seed savers and seed keepers all over the nation to find out what was still out there. So like you find a ton in Mexico, you find a ton from North Dakota, there's Potawatomi, there's Ponca, there's all this agricultural seeds that are still alive despite so many of them most likely being lost during that 1800 push to the west from the U.S. government, because we did lose a lot. We have no idea how to say how much we lost, but we did lose a lot. So we're lucky that we have any of this, but we should be celebrating this amazing diversity that we have of these strains that go back thousands of years from all these regions around huge parts of North America. And there's just like so much. There's browns, there's yellows, there's golds, there's spotted, there's flower corns, there's dent corns. There's all sorts of cool stuff that we could be celebrating, and not just the GMO corns that we're so used to in everything today, right? Beans are the same thing. So much diversity. Squash is the same thing. So we're looking at like, how do we utilize this knowledge moving forward? So to reclaim health and culture through food, utilizing the knowledge of our past, we're not trying to do a timepiece and just recreate something that happened a long time ago. We're trying to move this forward and to actually evolve it for the first time in a long time. Because as Indigenous peoples and communities, we've been locked into a state of oppression pretty much since the inception of our reservation systems, and it's taken us a long time to be able to break through from that, right? So we started, as my company, hiring a lot of Indigenous peoples and getting them outdoors and showcasing that we could do this style. Like, we don't have to follow the same mold. We can go out and harvest our own food. We can showcase the flavors of where we were. So we started making Indigenous food taste like exactly where we were, understanding the history and the land and the plants and the animals and the peoples that have lived there for a long time, and making it a part of our daily practice. Even hiring an ethnobotanist on my crew from the very beginning, because we work with plants as chefs all the time, and having an ethnobotanist on board really helped us expand and grow. And it was much easier to teach an ethnobotanist how to cook than a cook ethnobotany. But when you start seeing food, you see food everywhere because it's all around us constantly, and there's so much flavor that we can be playing with, making foods that taste the right where we are, taking the time to make our own spice mixes, and just having fun with it and growing this community, like making businesses out of this that was celebrating only regional Indigenous foods, cutting out European colonial ingredients like dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar. We stopped even using beef, pork, and chicken just to prove a point of protein, and really making true Indigenous foods, but making it a modern contemporary vision of it, but holding on to that authenticity, making food taste like where we are. There's rabbit, cedar, wild rice, cranberries, maple, and you can see all those ingredients standing on one spot in Minnesota just looking around, right? And that's how food should taste. And for us as chefs, it's fun to put artistry on plates, but the food itself was really had the story to tell. And for us to be able to keep this food simple and get it to Indigenous communities to celebrate, because some of these Indigenous communities haven't had these kinds of foods for a long time. Some of the elders might remember their grandparents cooking with these foods, but a lot of us who have lost our ways over this last century, and we have a lot of repair work to do when it comes to our health. And just this is just a map of Minnesota with all of the Dakota namespaces. So it's really, part of this is just really thinking again about the land that we're on. So for us, the work that we're really trying to do, we wanted to do something more than just opening one restaurant. So we opened up our nonprofit, which is a 501c3 called called NATIFs, which is an acronym for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. And we created a brand called Indigenous Food Lab that we're opening up this next year early in Minneapolis. And it's a nonprofit restaurant, which was really hard to pass through the IRS. But it's all focused on education, creating food access, and helping support to develop more Indigenous food producers out there. So we're going to be a center point where people can come to us, they can learn how, they can work inside the restaurant with us, they can try the restaurant as the public. We're going to double as an educational component where people can take, we'll develop curriculum, and we're going to be an incubator kitchen to help develop more businesses and research and development to continue to grow. So we want to showcase there's all sorts of stuff, and we want to be a center point for Indigenous education, which doesn't really exist out there right now. So we're starting in Minneapolis, and our goal is to work with the tribes around us to help them to develop their own Indigenous food entity to help those communities have at least one point for healthy Indigenous foods. And we see this being really important because we want to teach them how to, develop community gardens using heirloom seeds. We want to teach them about permaculture and utilizing the land space better, because we could do so much better landscaping our land. Lawns are absolutely stupid. We should be really putting our time into things that matter, and just putting food everywhere is something that we could easily do. And especially as a community, we can grow so much of it. So kitchens are the other part that's so important. We need people trained with commercial kitchens to be able to process these foods safely. We want to see more of this Indigenous food production happening on a larger scale. And we want people to understand that it really is up to Indigenous peoples to define what their foods are, because it's been a long time and we need to do this. But we want to open up Indigenous food labs in every area that we can, utilizing this nonprofit, almost like a franchise model, and just getting them out there. So for us, this is what the Indigenous evolution and revolution is all about. It's about just getting it out there, and anybody could learn from this. Any community, whether you're Indigenous or not, can understand the value of how a community can work together for its own food system and celebrate the diversity of its region. Because for us as Indigenous people, it's just about doing this for that next generation. They're the ones that it's important, and we want to see this on a global scale and help affect countries all around the world do the same kind of work. All right, I'm 40 seconds over.